So Engwe have just released the Engwe Engine Pro 2.0, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a bike with a lot of compromises. But let's try and compare it to the 1.0 or the 1. Let's have a look at that. So as I say, they've released the Engwe Engine Pro 2.0 and on the face of it, it looks like really good value for money. It's got torque sensor, it's got a 52-volt battery upgrade. Apparently they've done stuff to the frame, which I'll show you some images of shortly of how they tested it. And overall, it just looks like good value. But is it? So we all know the problems with the 1.0, which were frame snapping, gooseneck snapping, fenders dropping off and getting trapped in the wheel, causing lots of accidents. The main one being the frame snapping. But I assure you, the fender debacle was far worse than the frame snapping. Same with the goosenecks. And as we know, Engwe sort of kind of washed their hands of it, and here's where the problem with buying from Engwe begins. And it's not just Engwe, it's all Chinese bike companies, is they sell at these cheap high price points and then they can't afford to support the bike after in the UK. And I've made this point before. So if a battery fails, you then got to argue with them to get a new battery. And their new thing that they're doing for the battery thing is getting people to take the batteries apart, which is dangerous unless you understand the chemistry of batteries and you're sticking screwdrivers here, there and everywhere. It's not really a good idea. But this is what they're insisting on. Apparently Lankalese as well, they're insisting, from what I've seen on my Facebook pages, they're insisting that people now diagnose the batteries themselves. Great if you like fires. If you don't have the technical expertise, and it doesn't take much, it's not a massive expertise, but people don't understand the chemistry of batteries. And within that, they're putting people's lives in danger. Let's get back to this bike. Like I said, on the surface, it looks like good value for money. 52-volt battery, torque sensing. I think it's Logan brakes. I couldn't tell you for the life of me what the controller is. And I did nearly buy one to test it out, but my brain said, don't be stupid. It's basically had an upgrade of the paintwork, but the frame remains the same. The frame is the biggest weak spot of this bike. So the frame is its weak spot, and the frame doesn't seem to have been upgraded at all. And from the testing images that I've got of, they haven't tested it properly at all. They bung on half the weight of the claimed £330 rider that it's meant to be able to take, or workload. They've just done compression tests of up and down, but they've not done any torsion tests whatsoever from what I can see. If they want to send me videos of that, I'm quite happy to have a look at them. But your bike flexes in multiple positions when it's on the road, and especially when it's on suspension, and especially when it's on tyres. So what they've done is they've removed the tyres from the equation, they've taken the suspension out to a certain degree, and they haven't tested it point to point on the focal points of the bike frame. So they haven't tested it point to point through the axles. For some unknown reason, those points are just ignored when they've done this weight test looking at these images. Within that, it's not been properly tested. There's no torsion testing gone on whatsoever. So when your bike's riding around on the road, it's flexing from multiple positions, the tyres, the suspension, and basically when you're turning the bike, all this flexes the frame in different positions. And all they've done is a test that just basically does that. And that's no good whatsoever for a bike of this that's meant to claim to take this weight. I think they've taken the weight barrier off of their website, but it used to be £330, and if that's still the same, they've just put on half the weight. Do I trust that frame? No. No whatsoever. And I've also seen people say, oh, well, the 2.0, no issues yet. But the bike's been out a few weeks. You're not going to see this like we did with the Mark 1 a few months down the line. And even though they upgraded the frame on the Engwe Engine X, I've still seen pictures of those snapping. And the same issues with the mud guards, the same issues with the gooseneck snapping. So nothing's really been done. All they've done is they put more torque through a bike frame that I don't think can take it. And within that, do I think this bike's worth buying? I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. Like I said, I did come close to buying one just to test it out. But it's like anything else. I'll buy it, it'll disappoint me, and I've stuck with another bike, I'm going to sell it at a loss. And I didn't want to do that again. So, having seen Mr. Central Driver's review of him saying that the torque sensor doesn't really work very well. It doesn't work very well because it doesn't marry up with the controller very well. And if you go, I'll put a link in at the bottom of this in the comments section to his review of it, which I think is very interesting. He's one of the few reviewers out there that I actually trust. But like I said, adding his review into what my thoughts are sets alarm bells ringing in my head. And I don't think it's going to be long before we start seeing faults with the bike. There's been no major upgrades to the frame. And it amazes me that they stuck with that frame design, especially with the 3-link suspension, the pulley bolts coming apart, leaving the suspension loose. I'd have thought they'd have gone with the similar design to the Mate frame, but maybe they've got thousands and thousands of these frames pre-bought and they need to get rid of them. And that's my thinking. They don't care about you. Their customer service is dire. At best, it's dire. They have improved. I'm not going to just slate them for the sake of slating them. But with things like asking people to do work on their batteries, which, like I said, unless you understand battery chemistry, I wouldn't touch a battery with a barge pole. And it's not just them. Lancalese apparently has asked one of my followers to mess about with the battery. This goes back to the fact that they can't financially afford to support the bikes in the UK. Because if they have to replace a battery, that's a profit wiped out. And how many times are they going to need to do that? If something breaks, are you willing to wait 2 months for something like a pin to turn up? Or a new derailleur to turn up? Or a new gear lever to turn up? Or a new brake to turn up? They take months to send these out. The other thing is, to make this bike right, you'd have to change out the front suspension. It's dire. Headset, it's dire. That gooseneck would have to go, so you'd need to swap that out for BMX bars. And I wouldn't buy theirs either, because it's a one-piece unit. So what you'd be looking at is you want a proper BMX setup. So you want the clamp, a stem, and proper BMX handlebars, because you know they're not going to give way under tension. You'd have to swap out that mid-suspension because it does nothing. It's just basically a spring. And once you've done all that, plus the front forks are just dire. And they'd need replacing. So you're into another £700 on top to make the bike reasonably safe and usable. It's usable for lightweight people, but it doesn't mean that that frame isn't going to give way again. And that's its biggest compromise. They're still using that frame. Like I said, they just use the frame, the Mate X setup that frame uses for suspension. There's a picture I'll show you now. It might have made a difference because you're not putting the same torsion tensions all over that bike. That 3-pivot mid-suspension, it works, but it doesn't work well. And it's another compromise. It's a cheap compromise. I'm not sure if it's Logan brakes on this. Mr. Central Driver described them as non-make, so they might have got rid of Logan because they were too expensive and gone with a cheaper brake system. And I always thought Logan brakes were really good. It's one of the best things about the bike. So if you're thinking of buying this bike, have a really good think about it. Like I said, it represents fantastic value for money. For under £1,300, you're getting torque sensor, 52 volts. That in itself, colour display. The display itself doesn't show you current or percentage of battery left. It's still back down to the bars. You don't know what brakes you're getting. But like I said, all in all, as an overall package, if you're willing to put the money into it, it's good value for money. You could build yourself a good bike for about £2,000. But again, it's the frame that's the compromise. And that's the bit you need to understand. If that frame snaps, you're getting no support from Engwe. Now, I've had my frame snap on my Mark 1. A friend of mine had one snap on theirs. I managed to get theirs back. Because I bought my bike used, I got no support from them whatsoever. So you'll have to understand that them supporting you from China is a frustrating, expensive hobby. And if you have to wait for a part for 2 months, that's part of the riding season over. If you bought it in the spring for the summer, you're waiting 2 months for a part, and you know how wet it gets in the UK, you've lost half your riding season. Anyway, what about this bike? Again, no. And I advise people to wait or hang back until they've seen the long-term reviews of these coming through in 3 or 4 months' time. It's not exactly a long-term review, but it's going to understand more about what goes wrong with this bike, and I'm guessing it's going to be pretty similar to the other frames that they sell. I'm guessing it'll be the same as what happened before, which is exactly what happened with the 1.0 and the Engwe Engine X, and all the other bikes that they supply. And that's it. The next video I'm doing is the range video, which will be tomorrow, which will be on Sunday. And next week I'm doing a 10-point video about the top 10 things I wish I'd have known before buying a Chinese e-bike. It's worth watching. Have a nice day, everyone.